Welcome Year 8 to today's first lesson on the poem Human Interest by Carol Ann Duffy. You'll find this poem in your Identity Poetry booklet. It's an interesting poem because it deals with a different type of identity to those we've looked at before. So if you can grab your poetry booklets and we will begin. Okay, so the best way to start with a poem is to have it read aloud to you. As I read the poem aloud, what I'd like you to do is make any annotations of your own, so writing words and phrases down around your poem as I'm reading it. For the first thing, I'd like you to make notes on how the poem makes you feel, what the type of mood of the poem is. So add any adjectives that describe the mood around the poem as I read it. So here we go. Human interest. 15 years minimum banged up inside for what took 30 seconds to complete. She turned away. I stabbed. I felt this heat burn through my skull until reason had died. I slogged my guts out for her, but she lied when I knew different. She used to meet some prick after work. She stank of deceit. I loved her. When I accused her, she cried and denied it. Straight up, she tore me apart. On the Monday, I found the other bloke had bought her a chain with a silver heart. When I think about her now, I nearly choke with grief. My baby. She wasn't a tart or nothing. I wouldn't harm a fly. No joke. Okay, so if you'd like to pause the video here and make sure you've got down some of those adjectives to describe the mood of this poem, how the narrator feels or how it sounded as I read it. Now this poem deals with what we call an individual identity. The narrator of this poem is giving us an insight into their personality. Now what we need to talk about first is what's called unreliable narrators. So the person speaking in the poem is always called the narrator. We cannot for sure say that the person speaking is the poet's voice themselves. It's very rare, in fact, that the person talking in a poem is the poet, just like Charles Dickens isn't always the narrator of every Charles Dickens book, and other famous authors aren't always the narrator in their own stories. The only time we can say they are is in an autobiography, where it's a book about themselves. So we need to think about the narrator, the person speaking here, and what the difference between a reliable narrator, someone we can trust, and one that we cannot. So an unreliable narrator is a narrator we cannot necessarily trust everything they say. Usually we're accepting of what the person telling us is saying. We believe their point of view. So for example, we trust people with certain roles and positions in society, with certain identities. For example, we tend to trust teachers and believe what they tell us. Parents, we tend, especially when we're younger, to trust most of what they say to us. Police officers, we trust them to look after us in society, so we would believe them when they tell us the rules and the laws that we need to follow. Doctors, as and nurses, as well as medical staff, we trust them with our health, so we follow the instructions that they give us. I'd like you to think about different identities and people that we should or might not trust. So potential unreliable narrators. I'd like you to mind map, please, or list those depending on how you are writing out your notes. So think of as many people that we might find identity-wise in their roles unreliable that we shouldn't trust. So earlier we talked about unreliable narrators. Now the narrator of this particular poem, Human Interest, is a criminal. And we know that from the first few lines of the poem, where he says 15 years minimum, banged up inside for what took 30 seconds to complete. So the question that you need to write down in your answers, this is the third question. If you were banged up in this context, where are you located? Okay, so now that you've got that answer down, banged up as a phrase is what's called a colloquialism. So a colloquialism is a word or phrase that is not formal English language, but instead uses common phrases and slang. It's used in informal conversation. So we have our definitions over on the right hand side of formal and informal. So formal language is precise and strict English that gives a really good impression of the person speaking. So it's used in certain scenarios. Now informal language is language you might speak with family or friends or people you don't need to make an instant good impression on because you're already comfortable around them. So if banged up is a colloquial term, and that colloquial term means that you are in jail. Okay, what does this then tell us about our narrator, our character, if he is using this colloquial language? Well, it tells us that he is comfortable talking informally to us and doesn't mind using these slang terms. Now, what I'd like you to do for your fourth question to note down, please, is I'd like you to give an example of a person and a location or event where you should use formal language. So think about who you would use formal language to and where you might be to have that conversation in that formal language with that specific person. So here we have the quote, "I felt this heat burn through my skull until reason had died." In these lines, the poets used both a metaphor and personification to show us how intensely the narrator felt after stabbing his wife or girlfriend. Now, a metaphor is when something is described as being something else, linking those two things together. Usually, the best way to work out a metaphor is to think, well, do they literally mean that thing? Is it a fact, or is it actually painting us a picture of something else? Because it's impossible to be literal. Now, personification is the use of verbs to give human qualities and traits to something that is not alive. So again, the best way to spot personification is to look for the verb, then to look at the thing that's being described with that verb as doing the action and thinking, well, is that a living human thing or animalistic thing? And if it's not, then it's easy to spot. So your question to jot down the answer to for this slide is, if the metaphor is the heat burning through his skull, because that isn't literal, he doesn't literally have heat burning through his skull, it actually represents his rage and pain, then what has been personified? So I've helped you with the metaphor, but see if you can spot what has been personified in that quote. And remember, the quote is, "I felt this heat burn through my skull until reason had died." So for your last activity today, I want you to take a look at the second stanza. Now, a stanza is a poetic term, and it means a chunk of poetry, a bit like a paragraph. So in poetry, when there's chunks or sections that are separated by a blank line, like a paragraph when you drop down. Each chunk or section that has a gap in between it is called a stanza. So if you look at the poem, there are 4 stanzas in total in this poem, Human Interest. And we're going to look at the second one before we finish this particular lesson today. So the second stanza is only 3 lines long, and you can see those on the slide here. So a line is just from the left to the right before it drops down to the next line. So there are 3 lines in this second stanza, and there are 4 stanzas in the whole poem. So that's lines and stanzas. So let's have a look at this example. I'd slogged my guts out for her, but she lied when I knew different. She used to meet some prick after work. She stank of deceit. So I would like you to have a look closely at this stanza and find 3 things for me. So firstly, question number 6 that you're going to jot down, I'd like you to find in that stanza alone an example of a colloquialism. So remember, a colloquialism is informal, almost slang language. So I'd like you to jot down a phrase, a word or phrase that you think is a colloquialism. Then number 7, I'd like you to find an example of an expletive. Now, an expletive is a posh word for saying a swear word. So something that's deliberately rude about someone or something. So you can jot that word down for me for number 7. And then finally, your last one, I'd like you, because I gave you an example of a metaphor last time, I'd like you to find a metaphor in this stanza and jot that down for number 7. So you're looking for number 6, a colloquialism, number 7, an expletive, and number 8, a metaphor. And these will help us to complete our longer writing next time. Thank you for listening.